everyone. Welcome to this open forum session, which is entitled A Wake-Up Call from Nature. I am Magdalena Skipper. I'm Editor-in-Chief of Nature, which is a multidisciplinary journal publishing original research as well as science journalism. It's my great pleasure to be here leading this fantastic panel and being here with you as well as with you who are joining us remotely. Just as a reminder, this is an open session, so feel free to tweet or share your reflections on social media. If you do so, please use the hashtag WEF22. And also there's a second hashtag OpenForum22. A reminder about the structure of our session. So we will have a discussion here with my esteemed panelists for about an hour, after which we'll have half an hour for questions from you, from the audience. One thing I should share with you that Minister who is with us here will have to leave us after the first hour, won't be able to stay with us for the remaining 30 minutes. So without further ado, let me set the scene for our discussion. So a wake-up call from nature. So I rather suspect that many of you in the audience, like myself actually, are thinking that our session is mainly motivated by the pandemic, which of course is still ongoing. And I suspect that you'll be partly right. We've seen, but this is only partly true, because we've also seen rising temperatures in many parts of the globe, raging fires and flooding, so much so that in some parts of the globe homes have become uninsurable. We know from a series of science-based reports that our time is running out to reverse climate change and loss of biodiversity, to really transform the food systems also, so that we may have no hunger on the planet. All of this profound impact on our planet and on us, since we are part of the planet ecosystem, clearly impacts us as well, as I just said. But this realization that not everything is well is not new. In fact, it's far from new. 50 years ago already, we had an influential report entitled Limits to Growth, followed by Stockholm Declaration. Both emphasized the need to manage development by considering natural resources as well as economic and social concerns. So we've known for at least half a century that we need to shift towards sustainability. And yet we are here having essentially the same conversation, only with much greater urgency and much greater emergency. So indeed, a wake-up call from nature. So with me to discuss many issues that fit under this umbrella, as I said, I have a fantastic panel of speakers, so I'm going to introduce them, starting from the left here. So first is David Dow, who is Global Shaper at World Economic Forum, the forest lead of Climate Change AI and climate leader at Climate Reality Project. He's an advisor to the UN FCCC Resilience Frontiers and a mentor at Creative Destruction Lab, Paris. David is also the founder of Gain Forest and an AI researcher at ETH Zurich. Next to him, we have Marco Lambertini, who has 25 years of global conservation leadership experience. He works with world leaders, corporate executives, and civil society to forge a future in which people and nature thrive. He is Director General of WWF International, one of the world's largest and most respected conservation organizations. Next to him, I have Isabella Eckler, who's a virologist and an MD. She's Professor for Emerging Viral Diseases at University Hospital of Geneva and University of Geneva. She was a member of high-level European expert group proposing a roadmap towards stabilization of the COVID-19 pandemic in the European region, as her interests span pandemic prevention, diagnostics for emerging viruses as well. Next to her is Vivian Heijnen, who is the Minister of the Environment of the Netherlands. Her portfolio includes the transition to circular economy and other environmental issues such as hazardous substances, biocides and crop protection outside agriculture, air quality, traffic emissions and fuels. She's also responsible for public transportation and bicycle policy and sustainable transportation. And then finally, last but definitely not least, is Stefan Bancel, who is CEO of Moderna, a company that today needs no introduction, of course, thanks to the work on the developing of one of the leading COVID vaccines. And Stefan is a chemical engineer by training. So welcome to the panel. So even though in the beginning I said that when we talk about a wake-up call from nature, we have to look beyond the pandemic, I would like to start our conversation with focusing on the pandemic, because of course that is at the very center space of our mind. So I'm going to turn to you, Isabella, first, since you are a virologist, an expert in this area. And can you explain to us, again, what is the danger of diseases of zoonotic origin? Why are we concerned that the frequency with which we see them is quite likely to rise?
So we know that in nature, in animals, especially in mammals, we find a huge diversity of viruses, and among them are many which could become dangerous to us. So there are many virus families that are already known. They are very good in jumping the species barrier, so they are looking for new hosts, and when they get an opportunity, they can adapt to new hosts. One of them is the family of coronaviruses. There are many others, but these have just shown that they are really capable of doing that. And we know when we interfere with ecosystems, or when we interfere with animal communities, that these viruses then get a chance to seek new hosts or to get an opportunity to infect new hosts. And there are many different ways how this can happen, either that we invade the natural habitat, that we put livestock next to these animals, that animal species that normally are not in contact, that suddenly meet, then we create very huge herds when we have industrial animal farming, or it's ourselves who are moving into the forest, or we're logging down the forest, and we are stealing somehow the natural habitat of these animals. And all of this creates a kind of bridge of viruses that are there that normally would not be harmful for us to come in contact either with us or with our animal species, with our pets, with our livestock, and then either we become directly infected or these animals serve as an amplifying host into the human population. And there is very good evidence now that there are really risk zones. So when you cut down a forest, you will have a contact zone where on the one side you have high biodiversity, you have a lot of animals, and on the other side you have farmland, you have livestock, you have humans, and in that contact zone you really have a zone where you have the highest risk of new pathogens spilling over. It was also shown that climate change will force animals to leave their natural habitat, to move out, to seek to higher altitudes because they find better living conditions, and also they will start to compete for habitats. And that will lead to a situation where many, especially mammals, will meet for the first time that have never met before. And there is research that showed that this is already happening because of climate change. Animals have to change the way they live, and this will create new risks for pandemics, because we know there are many, many viruses out there, and if we get in contact with them, or if we build such a bridge, then we could have the next epidemic or maybe even pandemic.
So thank you for this explanation. And many heard the term zoonotic disease for the first time, probably, in the context of COVID-19. But just to be clear, the phenomenon is not new. The frequency that is something we should be concerned about.
Zoonotic disease just means it's a disease that jumps from animals to humans. And there are many examples. We know this for a very long time. But what we have observed in the recent decades, that these events, that viruses move out of their natural host and infect us or infect our livestock species, is becoming more and more frequent. And due to globalization, the consequences of such a spillover event are much larger than they were, let's say, 50 years ago.
Exactly. And so actually, David, can I bring you in here? Because, we just heard about how, for example, deforestation, changing of habitats is increasing the frequency of these potential events, new species coming into contact, changing range in the habitats. You do a lot of work in the context of forest, measuring forest degradation, deforestation. Tell us a little bit about your work and why it's important in its own right, but also in the context of the current pandemic and potential other pandemics or epidemics.
So besides being a global shaper for the World Economic Forum, I'm an AI researcher at ETH Zurich, where we develop algorithms using satellite data, drone imagery, and also on-the-ground measurements to understand and see the changes in forests. Nowadays, deforestation is one of the worst things that can happen to the planet, and it leaves huge scars on the planet. You can see it by just with your eyes. If you look at satellite imagery over a couple of years, you do see very, very distinct patterns of legal and illegal deforestation. For example, one of the patterns we can observe from satellite data is what we call a fishbone structure, where in the Amazon, the deforestation is so large that you cut down a long road in the middle and then side roads that looks like a fishbone from a spatial view. And then it expands, and it's estimated that we lost already since the industrial age half of the world's forest. This is important because as there's a connection to the forest itself, has a connection to multiple crises that our planet is facing right now. The biodiversity crisis, with the driving out the species out of the forest, that correlates and is connected to a large health crisis, but also, not a lot of people know, but the global deforestation, if tropical deforestation would be a climate emitter, it would be the third largest country in the world right after the US and China. So it's a huge impact on climate, on the emissions. It's taking too less of attention from leaders and governments in that space, because there's no way, everyone can agree on this, that we can fulfill any of the 1.5 goals the Paris Agreement has set without stopping deforestation. And lastly, deforestation is important because it's the people in the center that suffer the most. 1.2 billion people are living in the forest. They are depending on the forest as a livelihood, as communities, indigenous communities call the forest, the rainforest, their home, and they are driven out by illegal land invasions, oftentimes also get killed by protecting their homes.
Very important and powerful reminder of the many different dimensions that we have to keep in mind. We'll come back to the issue of people a little bit later, because of course it's crucial in the context of forest preservation, but also in the context of other habitats as well. I think that's an important point. But I'd like to bring Marco in at this point. So Marco, I noticed that when you arrived in Davos, you shared a tweet. You said, "We must embrace a nature-positive by 2030 global goal for nature to have more biodiversity at the end of the decade than at the start. No ifs, no buts. It's an imperative." So can you elaborate on what you mean by a nature-positive goal for nature?
Thank you. So first of all, one word on the context. You mentioned we lost half of the forest already. We have lost also half the coral reefs, 85% of the wetlands. We have lost 70% of wildlife populations globally in the last 40 years. And we have 1 million species on the brink of extinction. And I can go on and on and on with other statistics that show how serious the impact that we have been having on nature over the last, frankly, 60 years has been dramatic. This is what the scientists call the great acceleration of unsustainable development. unsustainable use of natural resources. So the trajectory is catastrophic, is as dangerous as climate change. In fact, is connected to climate change, because nature today is still buffering climate change in a massive way. A huge amount of the emissions that we produce are absorbed, neutralized by nature, forest, rivers, wetlands, the ocean. So by losing nature, we are actually beginning to affect our own lives, not just nature itself. That's the new eco-awakening, I would say, of these last few years, where we're beginning to realize that nature loss is not just an ecological issue, it's not just a moral issue, because we feel strongly for having to coexist with the rest of life on the planet. It's actually an issue that touches and affects and threatens our lives, our economy, our health, our security as a society. Wars, conflicts are increasingly driven by either destabilization because of climate change or loss of natural resources. So, within this context, we are advocating, and not just we, WWF, but many other organizations, in fact, even governments, that we need to embrace a clear global goal for nature, like we have embraced a clear global goal for climate. On climate, everybody is very clear today. We need to drive towards being carbon neutral, net zero emissions by 2050. The whole world is aligned in delivering that. We are not moving fast enough. We are not delivering it fast enough, but everybody's clear and everybody's accountable to that. On nature, there is not such a clear direction. So that's what we want to codify, a nature positive, because net zero for emissions is fine, but for nature, net zero is not enough. We actually need to halt the loss, and we need to restore as much of what we have lost, because nature has an incredible capacity to bounce back. And so nature positive, in simple words, and we finish here, is more nature at the end of the decade than we have today. More forest, more fish in the ocean and in the rivers, more pollinators in the countryside, more biodiversity worldwide. Can be measured easily and can be delivered. In fact, it's not just a question if it can be delivered, it must be delivered to avoid serious consequences if we don't.
Thank you. So based on what you said, I have a question for everyone on the panel. You said we must drive change. Who is we in this context? Do you want to start, Marco, since you made that comment, and then I'll work my way down the panelists?
It's everyone, because the system is broken. The production and consumption system, the development model of the last 50, 60 years has been based on taking nature for granted, using resources unsustainably, don't think, ignore the consequences. COVID has highlighted the fact that there are consequences. There are very heavy consequences, as much as climate change, very heavy consequences for our broken relationship with nature. So we is everybody, but of course everybody has got different responsibilities. We ask governments to support a very strong global agreement that drives the whole world to deliver a nature positive goal. We ask businesses to comply with a global goal and develop plans that reduce their footprint in order to become nature positive. Nature positive agriculture, nature positive fishing, nature positive cities, nature positive infrastructure. All this is possible. If you have it as a goal, it's possible to be delivered. And then the consumers, us. Our lifestyles, the way we live our lives, what we eat in particular, the energy we consume, the commodities we buy, that can make a huge difference. Remember one thing, every single person doing one thing multiplied by at least 3 billion in the developed rich world, plus another 5 in the developing world. So each individual act can make a huge difference. And of course, support government and business transitions as well.
Thank you for this. I was just reminded of when you were calling to all of us as consumers, and of course, regardless of what we do, in addition to that, we are consumers. I was reminded of a comment that was made on another panel that earlier today I moderated, and this was around blue food, so food that is aquatic in origin. And it was the Minister of Environment of Ecuador who said that they were just introducing a label on menus in restaurants, especially in Galapagos Islands, to show the consumers the carbon footprint of the meal they were ordering. Now that is an really interesting way of surfacing how you're contributing to global change, of course. So I'm actually going to modify my questions slightly, if I may, since we have great representation of different sectors on the panel. So Isabel, may I start with you and actually ask you to, when I say we, well, when Marco said we, scientists, researchers are of course part of that we. So what kind of responsibility do scientists and research community have in this context?
So I think since the pandemic, a lot of the perception what scientists can do and how scientists communicate has really changed. And I believe it's really important that scientists, they leave their ivory tower and they communicate, because it's nice if we have these findings, if we tell them each other on conferences, we all agree on it. But I think we have to make it clear to everyone what the implications of these findings are, and whether it comes to zoonotic diseases. We know already a lot. We know where zoonotic diseases come from. We know how viruses spill over. This is nothing new, and a lot of that was already known before the pandemic, and a lot of warnings were there, but they were not heard, or maybe we communicated not well enough. But I think it's not that we need more research to understand how pandemics evolve. Of course we need research, but I think the core principles, how new diseases can cause a problem and where they come from and what are the drivers, the core principles are in fact clear. The question is, what are the next steps to take? And I think we speak a lot now about pandemic preparedness in terms of what diagnostics do we need, what vaccines do we need, how can we become as a society more resilient and better prepared. But I think we do not speak enough about prevention of pandemics. So what does it mean? What changes in our life and what changes in governments and what changes in industry do we need? And I think it must also be clear that this will not be an easy change. It will not be an easy task. There will be some businesses who will lose money. There will be some businesses who have to change. So I think we should also address that it will not be easy. But in the end, this transformation will make the lives better. And in the end, a lot of money that will be put into that will pay off many, many times. And I think that's really also something to have this long-term perspective, to know if it might be painful for us, or we have to leave some practices that we like, or some cultural things that we are used to, that are convenient for us. But for the long term, it will make our lives much better, because it will make our lives also healthier. And I think it's something, especially me as a medical doctor working in such a field, sometimes we have this perception that health and disease is only something that happens in humans, and it's not like that. So when we think of our health and how we can protect our health, we also have to think of the health of animals and of the environment. And I think this is maybe something that is sometimes not really clear to everyone, that our health is really linked to the rest of the planet. And if we cannot secure the health of ecosystems, of forests, of the animals that we eat, of the animals that we consume, then we will have a very hard time to protect our own health. And I think COVID was the perfect example for that.
Absolutely, really important statement. And of course, increasingly we talk about planetary health, right? Living within the planetary boundaries that create or maintain the whole system in the healthy state. And I think all too often we tend to talk about us and the planet as if we were somehow outside of it. Whereas of course we are an integral part of it. It's not sort of us and them. Whatever we do to the planet, we do unto ourselves. And indeed, as you say, as a medical doctor, doctors always say prevention is better than the cure. So we should really be embracing that in a wider context. So Viviane, what about from your perspective as a minister, from a governmental perspective, what are the responsibilities? What are the key issues?
Well, first of all, what I really enjoy in this panel is that it can be quite a difficult subject and complex subject. And I think it is very important as people who are very involved in it, but and very knowledgeable, that you also take your time to translate it in a way that everyone understands what we are talking about. And as a relative newcomer, I really understood what you were saying when it comes to viruses, for example, and that's very, very important to also raise awareness, because I think that that is one of the first responsibilities that also governments have, but we share that responsibility, in my opinion. And what is also very important is to exchange knowledge. I spoke to my colleague in Ecuador as well today, and we really exchanged best practices and also some concerns, because they are doing very important things in Ecuador when it comes to, for example, creating a circular economy, erasing plastics from the system, because at the Galapagos Islands they really have a big challenge when it comes to plastics and changing habitats. But more than 80% of the pollution does not come from the country itself. It comes even from other parts of the world. So we can be the best kid in the class, as we would say in Dutch, but it doesn't help us, especially the Netherlands being a very small country, if we don't share the knowledge that we have, and if we don't make sure that we team up with other big countries, with companies, and create enough awareness that we don't have 2.7 planet Earths, and we are using up 2.7 planet Earths at the moment. We will run out of resources at some point. I come from a region where we had big floods not that long ago. It was in the south of the Netherlands. We are very specialized when it comes to water, but we also use our small country very intensely. And we have issues when it comes to soil and water management, in combination with the extreme pressure that we are putting on our nature and on our globe. And in Belgium and Germany, it was unfortunately even worse. People died of floods in 2021. That's what we're talking about at the moment. And we have to change our mindset. And the good thing is that it's coming. And as the Netherlands, we want to also play our part in that. But we will have to do it together, because you cannot do it alone. And one of the other points of attention, in my opinion, when I'm talking about using up 2.7 planet Earths, we need to also raise awareness among consumers and really make them aware, and that's what I talked to my colleague from Ecuador about as well. How can you make sure that everyone feels part of the transition that we have to make? Because our ancestors, several centuries ago, before the Industrial Revolution, they were much more in tune with nature. They lived with the seasons. And I'm not saying we have to go back several centuries, but we have to raise awareness about the fact that we cannot continue the way that we are doing now. So also investing, for example, in innovation is something we can do as a government. And that is what we do. We try to stimulate companies, but also universities, to come up with good and better solutions. And I hope that we will continue to do so.
Very important points, and I particularly enjoyed your example, your reminder to all of us that sometimes we think that global is in opposition to local, but actually your example, for example, of pollution that may become an acute local problem that actually has global or much broader provenance illustrates the point very well of the interconnectivity of the problems and solutions. That it's just a matter of scales, right? Local versus global scale. Absolutely. Stefan, what about from your perspective, from perspective of the private sector that's been very much in the public eye, part of collaborations, conversations with governments, researchers at this intense time? What's the responsibility and the opportunity?
Sure. So if you think about the we, as you described it, governments, academia, business, not-for-profit, consumers. I don't think we are doing enough, all of us. And as my colleague said, time is our worst enemy. And I think this is one of the notions that I think a lot of people don't appreciate. And I'll come back to it in a minute. And so I think as a business, we have to lead. And we just have to do, using the best science, to try to be at the forefront of what can be done. And what I really want to do with Moderna is to try to set the example to other companies, because companies tend to be competitive, of what can be done. And we have this unique opportunity that the company is growing and it's still new. So we don't have dozens of plants that have been built 50 years ago. So we're building new plants as we speak, including one, for example, in Kenya. And we said very clearly the goal to the team, which is use the best material, the best technology available. You should not try to save a few $1 million. You need to do it because we're going to be with 40 years with this plant, and this has to be net zero. And there's just no way around it. And I think, as my colleagues have said, if you set a goal, then you achieve it. As humans, we're very good at getting things done. And so you need to have a clear goal. And I think the role of business is really important because one of my frustrations as a citizen of the world is we've been talking about this climate issue for as long as I can remember. I'm turning 50 this summer. And I'm very disappointed in general by governments in terms of there's a lot of things we could have done for a long time that we decided because it was not popular not to do. And I think that I have a responsibility as a CEO of a company to make sure my company uses the best technology to reduce our footprint on the planet, to impact our employees and how our employees behave because they have families, they have friends, and so if they set the way, that is great. I think consumers have a huge role to play into it, and one of the things that makes me optimistic, because I'm an entrepreneur, so I have to be optimistic, is the young generation. I think the young generation, and I think David is a good example on this panel, gives me a lot of hope. I stopped eating meat because of my 18-year-old daughter, who for actually a couple of years, I was super slow, and I apologize. And for a French guy, stopping eating meat is a big deal, no more steak frites and other things. And I think that's something that everybody can do. If you're 50-year-old, French guy can do it. I think really anybody can do it. It's just a question of setting the goal, and then you just move on with your life, and you can have a great life. And I think we all have to do this because if, as a business leader, I impact my employees and they impact their friends and the community where we live, is step by step we're going to get the world a better place. On the point of time, I want to make an analogy to the pandemic, which is most people do not realize that a lot of the laws of nature are not linear. And our brains are, as humans, thinks linearly. That's how we're wired since we used to live in the forest when there was nothing else. And I saw it in the pandemic and I was shocked by it because you had so many people like, yeah, it's only a few cases, Like, guys, can you do any modeling? Because viruses go pretty fast. It's going to be everywhere very, very soon. And I think we have the same issue with the climate, which is people think we have time. People think it's somebody else's problem. But I worry that we might even have passed the point of no return because there's so many negative feedback loops on the planet that we do not understand yet. We have to be very humble. It's like with biology. We have to be very humble. It's a very complex system, and I think every day matters. And all of us, all of you guys in the room, we can all have a huge impact.
So two things you said I wanted to follow up on. The first one was your statement about governments, the fact that you're disappointed with governments. So here's the thing. Most of us live in countries where we elect our governments for a relatively short period of time. The issues we're talking about here are long-term issues. There is a discrepancy here in the sort of goals and interests of a government versus longer-term goals and interests of nature. Anyone on the panel, would you like to comment on this? Should we be somehow demanding something else of our politicians, of our government? Should we be electing them on a different basis? Change our electoral systems? Any comments on that?
I think it's not the electoral system that's a problem here, but the people who basically elect. It's not a homogeneous mass. It's, as we said already, the we, right? It's business leaders, it's young people, it's elderly people. There are different interests that are always fighting between political candidates and the candidates who can represent them the best. And oftentimes these interests, people who are already established from existing sectors, right? Because the climate change is something that disrupts a lot of old industries. These old sectors, they have a lot of power and also hold a lot of interpretation power and therefore can influence a lot in that voting system. So I don't think the voting system is the problem here, but it's more like how do we make people understand from all sectors that this is an issue worth sacrificing potentially profit, worth sacrificing other plans, because it's so urgent that we need to address it immediately because of the exponential growth of the problem that we potentially can face.
Absolutely, and this indeed ties in with the second comment that you made that I wanted to sort of amplify here for the panel maybe to comment on, and that's this issue of time combined with linearity. If we look at, again, coming back to the title of our discussion, a wake-up call from nature, the nature alarm clock has been ringing for quite some time now, and yet we're sort of asleep or half asleep. The pandemic came, and the intensity of the problem made us do actually quite amazing things together, right? It's not perfect. Let's not get too excited, because of course there are parts of the world which fared much less well than others, but we did do amazing things collectively, and collectively across the sectors and across the globe, at least parts of the globe. And yet, we have another huge emergency. Well, we have many, but of course, climate change is probably the most obvious one. But because it unfolds with a different dynamic, we somehow stay asleep. So, as you just said, David, how do we convey that sense of emergency? I mean, many have tried. Interesting question. Marco, you're sitting forward?
This is a topic I absolutely love because it does really connect to two major weaknesses of our species. First of all, we have been evolving ourselves under the same natural laws of any other animal. It's not like we're special. And we've become cultural very, very recently compared to our biological history. So we still have inside, and I am a great believer of behavioral genetics in many ways, we still have inside the urge of hunters and gatherers like we started in the very early days. With a difference that we're living today in a capitalist development economic model and in a highly powerful technological society. So the only way to, and that has happened in the last 70 years with the promotion of technology and the rise of capitalism, we've been hitting nature very heavily. And by the way, we have also exacerbated inequality in the world at the same time. So how do we mitigate that natural, unfortunate, natural urge to gather resources and not distribute by understanding that it is a threat? I'm saying this publicly, which is a little bit tricky because it's a bit provocative, but actually in natural laws, the survival instinct of any individual, of almost every species, reacts very strongly to a threat, because a threat is what makes you feel for your life. And so that's, I think, what's happened in COVID. I'm Italian. I wasn't in Italy at the time, but my family was. Italy was one of the first countries hit in Europe very heavily with a lot of casualties, as you remember. I never seen Italians more compliant with regulation and laws than on those days. And I say this with great respect and great admiration for my own compatriots, because people were very worried, very worried. And so I think we need to go back to what I said at the beginning. We need to really internalize that climate change, nature loss, from overfishing to use of pesticides, the way we deforest in order to grow our food, etc., are all things that ultimately are going to hit us. They are a threat to us. They're an existential threat for humanity. More than us, our children, in fact, but not longer than that. The horizon of the impact is very close. So I think we have to culturally overcome our unfortunate, maladapted natural instinct That was okay when we were living in the forest like any other species, but now that we live in such a powerful society able to alter geophysically the planet, not just biologically, we have to just internalize that and refrain, constrain our behaviors, because at the end of the day, that's what we need to change. The way we live, that's the big systemic change that we need to see happening soon.
Can I respond to that?
Please.
Because I think that's a very good analysis. What is very important when taking measures, also as a government, is public support for the measures that you're taking. And politics has become somewhat faster over the last couple of years. People also change faster. It used to be the case that people really chose for a political career, but now it is people are relatively short in office. And the problems that we have take a lot of time also to analyze. I mean, I only started very recently. I'm very passionate about the topic, but I still have a lot to learn. And I also hope I will have the time to really make an impact. But I will need time. I need to invest in my network, and I need to learn from everyone, for example, here at the World Economic Forum, to see how I can really make an impact back home and to also translate it to the rest of the world and to help them take some extra steps. And in order to do that, I think it is also very important for us politicians and companies and also academics to take everyone along in the transition. And that means informing them, but it also means, I always say, if you live in a rented home, which has single glass, which is badly isolated, you cannot afford solar panels on your roof, and you have a gas bill that goes literally through the roof, as I said earlier today, then you don't feel part of the transition that we're talking about today. So we always have to keep an open mind to the people that are being forgotten. One of my colleagues I spoke to earlier said we should leave no one behind, and I think that is really the case in this transition that we're going through.
Very important point, which actually brings me to a topic which we touched on before. And this is something I know that, David, you work with indigenous people, people who live in the forest. And, you know, a second ago we were talking about bringing everyone along on this journey, regardless of where they are in society and what their capability is. It's important that we remember that we bring along the indigenous people, people who live in local communities, be it in forests or in the countryside in general. Tell us a little bit about that engagement and, in turn, what we can learn from those communities, how those communities can guide us in listening to nature.
Maybe a little context on this. So I, like Isabella, actually was or still see myself as an aspiring scientist. So I don't expect myself actually to sit here. Over the last years, I've joined the COP, United Nations Climate Change Conference, by just random coincidence, first as an engineer, joining some random student event, then looking more and deeper into the issues that are on this international level. First as a scientist, trying to explain with the V, okay, good, we have this technology, there's a climate urgency, I'm young, I'm gonna get like a lot of these effects. Why don't you understand me? Understanding slowly, okay, different people, different interest groups speak different languages. Some people, like young people, like to speak about the urgency, but other business-oriented people like to speak about the price, and threat is, for example, experienced differently. For example, a threat to your current business model is potentially greater than the existential threat our planet is serving. So we are in this panel, we are, of course, like fortunate enough to see the threat as the existential threat in the planet, but I can promise you that not everyone agrees on this existential threat as well. And this really pushed me towards moving out of the ivory tower of science and trying to understand why people don't get it, right? And when I was attending these COP sessions, I realized that just learning about the facts of nature which is one of the least appreciated areas where we potentially have the most impact in climate, but one of the least financed in all of climate finance, like literally 3–4% of all the climate finances goes actually into nature, that the people who decide these climate finances are also not the people who steward nature. Like if you look at the numbers, indigenous communities and local communities in the global south, they make 5% of the world's population, but they protect 80% of the world's terrestrial biodiversity. That's an insane number. But if you walk around Glasgow, Madrid, Bonn, all these climate conferences, they're barely having a seat on the table. That's why the climate youth movement, like Friday for Futures, is trying to have indigenous people walking in front of the protests such that photographers and journalists can take pictures of them, and they still don't take the pictures of them. They'd rather take pictures of Greta. Greta's not speaking and leaving them to speak, and still they are getting ignored. And my work is basically very much trying to see, okay, they are a rich community protecting us from a climate catastrophe. Where, for example, using my scientific connections, I work with the Kayapo people in Brazil. They are protecting a connected forest area in the Amazon rainforest that is the size of Iceland. There are 10,000 people. It's one of the highest deforested rates of forests in the world. If you burn down that forest, it will be the emission of the United States in a year. And they are having trouble raising funds, having trouble getting their voices out. I mean, look around there. Rarely, you don't see a lot of indigenous people around at the WEF as well. So really, really, really what's important here is to not forget who are the real superheroes that are protecting us right now from a climate catastrophe bomb through nature, people who are protecting at the front lines, people who have contributed the least to destroying nature on the climate catastrophe, but suffering the most from its effects, from the changes, from destruction of nature, also from the inequality that we experience here. And this is basically also the reason why I decided to sit here and tell you about this story.
And what is the best way to, so they are clearly engaged because that's their life. What's the best way for us to bring them to the table, to the discussion, so they can inform our own thinking for what needs to be done and how it needs to be done?
I think one of the most important parts is to understand that indigenous wisdom is often differently expressed than scientific Western wisdom. But there's so much value in it. For example, we did a paper with an indigenous colleague, and she was talking very in an eye perspective and about how to best preserve and restore forests and replant areas. And she was talking about, for example, this flower needs to be in this area because of sunshine. And we literally, without looking too much, and it's also a little bit our fault in South America, things are done very hectically, and we didn't have time to double check her essay that she submitted. We had really, really bad feedbacks from reviewers saying, who did you hire to write this report? Okay, making this flower, like humanizing this flower, right? Because this is not the scientific language you're using. But me, on the other hand, thinking, okay, this reviewer potentially would never know as much as this person who's like planting and taking care of these flowers, but the language and the acceptance for this knowledge is missing, right? So one of the things I think is really important for us is to understand that these people have doing a tremendous work, suffering the most, and we do need to emphasize this every time we work with nature. We talk to our policymakers that, hey, we already have a really, really good steward there. Just let them, we hold their land, let them do what they can do best, like we let business do what they can do best if we have the right incentives for like a clean transition. And
so that goes back to the comment that Viviana made earlier about exchange of information, right? Across different stakeholders, perhaps speaking different language, but recognizing that different stakeholders can make a contribution. Please go ahead.
I just wanted to comment on that. So I think one problem is maybe also that nature is seen as something that is free, that doesn't have a price. But we know, for example, when you work, for example, on viruses or on antivirals or on substances, that we maybe still have a lot of unknown, let's say, substances, plants, mechanisms in the wild that could also help us for medicine. So, for example, it's known that in rainforests, due to this high diversity, maybe the next antibiotic comes from there, or maybe the next drug that is effective against cancer comes from one of these plants. And we would be willing to pay a high price for a drug or for a vaccine or maybe for a new technology, but because it comes from nature, we consider it not really worthless, but we don't really see the price of this resource that we have. And I think that that's maybe also something that could be enforced, that protecting this will also give us something back, because we might discover something new. And also we know that forests and also ecosystems, they work like a buffer against diseases. And we know that preventing a disease is much cheaper than having to deal with a disease. And I think that might be also one aspect that we don't really value what is out there.
Absolutely. Marco?
That's a fundamental point. I think we are just not valuing nature. We are not pricing nature. Bees never send an invoice, and we should pay for the pollinators that produce 2/3 of our food. And back to your comment, Minister, I think it's super important. We need to, that's exactly what we are. We are in the middle of a transition, at the beginning of a transition. We need to support the transition, but we need to support it by valuing nature, but also I have to say, we need leadership. It's true that government needs the support of the people, but also government is supposed to be leading as well, like businesses, like civil society, like everyone in our own space. We are still in this crazy situation where there are $1.8 trillion spent by governments around the world, including the European Union, for subsidies to sectors like agriculture, fishing, forestry, energy, that are actually supporting nature-negative activities. And it is possible to redirect those subsidies towards nature-positive activities. It is possible. It's still spending money, is not letting people down, but is spending it in a different way. I know it's not easy. Don't get me wrong, I'm not making this simple. But that's where we need to come together and ride this moment of awareness, because people are beginning to be ready to that transition. You can see on energy more than anything else, but on food, it is also possible in agriculture. So that's the time. And I may be worried. I'm going to make a comment on the war of Russia and Ukraine, because there is a massive destabilization of the food system, inflation going up the roof. It was a long time that a war wasn't involving big economies, big supply chain players like Russia and Ukraine. And so we are all feeling the pinch, and the most vulnerable countries even more so around the world, as usual. But we need to be careful at this time of crisis, like COVID or like the war, not to go back, not to fall into the temptation to say, oh, this is scary, let's invest in intensive agriculture, let's invest in more drilling of oil and coal in Europe. Poland has just proposed to start again the trading of coal within Europe. I mean, we have to stop coal. Coal is the dirtiest of the fossil fuels. So we should not go back. We should take the opportunity of a crisis, whether it is a pandemic, whether it is, unfortunately, a tragic crisis like the one in Ukraine, to actually move forward, not to move backwards.
Absolutely. And then the question then becomes, how do we leverage that synergy of leadership from governments, but then the industry, the private sector, so that the funds go where they should go, as opposed to in this retrograde fashion that you just gave an example of one proposition, and the societal direction. We don't have an economist on the panel, of course, but that will be another interesting voice. We are actually coming to the end of our allotted time for this conversation. But before we wrap up, I wanted to ask each one of you to give your recommendation or your wish. You know, we all agreed with the fact that from each of your perspectives, from our collective perspective, we know very well that, you know, as I said earlier, nature has been ringing the alarm clock for a long time, and we know we're in trouble. We also know time is running out, and we also know the problem is not linear, as Stefan said. So is an emergency situation. What is the single thing, do you think, would make the biggest difference in us collectively sitting up and taking action? Not just talking about it, we've been talking about it for a long time. Stefan, I'm going to start with you.
So I will not respect the rule. I'm going to propose two. One of the things around what we eat. I just say if we just all stop eating meat, I think there will be a huge impact right away. Doesn't need any law, doesn't need anything, it's just behavior. And the other one is around use of energy. You know, you can decide when you buy a car, do you need a car or not? You know, can you go by bicycle or public transportation or whatever? And what type of car you decide. This is all things we do ourselves.
Thank you. Viviane?
Well, I think one of the things we really need to do is raise awareness of the situation that we are in and the role that everyone can play themselves in transitioning towards a new and more sustainable model that the Earth can manage. And as a government and as governments, I hope that we will continue to innovate and stimulate innovation. Obviously, and I completely agree, leadership is necessary from a government perspective, but I would say from all levels. It's important in academics, it's important in business life, it's important when it comes to NGOs, and it's important when it comes to inhabitants of this planet. Everyone has to step up and take responsibility.
Isabella?
Yeah, I can only agree with Stefan. So I think if there's one thing that every one of us can do, it's probably what we eat, and it's probably stop eating meat or eat less meat, because we know there are many effects of livestock, building a bridge for new pathogens, also increasing antibiotic resistance. So it's something we did not talk about. It's not a virus. It's also sometimes called the silent pandemic, because it's not so obvious, but it's a huge problem. And it also helps to make better use of the land that we have already for land use, so not to increase that. It's probably the biggest thing that everyone can do, and it's easy, I think. So there are many alternatives now.
Absolutely. Marco?
Yeah, definitely food. Food production on land is driving 80% of deforestation today, simple as that. And overfishing in the ocean is equally destructive. And so definitely sustainable food.
David?
Food was mentioned, so I'm going to raise another issue, which is climate funds. So we've been promised, pledged over the years, $100 billion for climate. The countries and governments have not delivered any of these numbers anywhere close to it. One of the best ways to stop deforestation, it's clear, is to pay and support these local communities, indigenous communities, and global south countries in having a sustainable alternative that they can. I mean, there's no evil player here. It's really like there are no options. And with money from the global north that can support the global south, we could create new economic opportunities that don't require to destroy the forest. And the money is missing. Push your governments, raise awareness, because this is only like not going anywhere if the money is not flowing.
Thank you. So very interesting. We had a number of calls here just now. Certainly raising awareness, innovation were mentioned, but by far and away, almost all panelists agreed that actually where we can really make a difference is something that each one of us has control over, really voting, so to speak, with your feet. Change your diet, and we will make a huge impact on the planet. It's actually very simple, but so effective. Incredibly, in my view, it's an incredibly encouraging message, actually. It was so empowering as well. So with this, I'm going to pause our discussion because unfortunately, Minister Heinen is going to have to leave us for other duties. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you. So I'm going to open up for questions from the floor. Please, if you have any questions, there's a microphone. There's a question already here in the front row. Please.
Thank you all for being here. I'm very excited to take your insights back to my organization and figure out what we can do better. My question is on the topic of the cost of sustainability, and not necessarily from an investment or transition perspective, but from the perspective of the consumer. And I know the topic of food choice came up, which draws a nice parallel. Now I'm from New York, and prices may vary, but if I want to get a salad, it's going to cost $15 versus a cheeseburger that costs 99 cents. Now, those with the means have the ability to choose between the cheeseburger and the salad, and similarly, those with the means have the ability to choose more sustainable but often more expensive products and consumption habits. And so, as Marco mentioned, the 3 billion people in developed countries versus 5 in developing, there are obvious implications around reducing the price point for sustainable options. And so I'm curious if any of the panelists have any insight around what is being done or can be done better in order to make sustainable consumption more affordable.
Excellent question. Would anyone, Stefan?
We needed the minister because this is what,
Yeah.
what governments really have to normally regulate, but maybe Stephen.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few things we can do. I mean, one is local farming and eating in season. I think we have become part of a 20th century culture to want, whatever we want all year long. And this is what drives, as you know, a lot of the cost. So I don't know we're going to really have a way to go and fight the 99 cents burger, because unfortunately that's what they cost. But I think if we can really help a local community, to create farms and eat what is in season, I think you start to make a step forward.
I would highlight again the regulation dimension, and I think the intervention of governments from subsidies, redirection, to actually capping some of the cost. What happened right now with the cost of fossil fuel? It's gone up. Everybody feels the pinch. In some countries, really, is bringing down the livelihoods of poor families that can't afford those prices. Yet, Shell has tripled their profit in the last 3 months. Tripled. So there's something wrong here, and I think government needs to step up.
Maybe one aspect is also if you would calculate the true price of this piece of meat in this burger, it would not be 99 cents. It would be much, much higher if you would calculate all the costs it has on the environment, on producing animals at such a cheap price, on the risks that you have, maybe because you need antibiotics, you have all the waste from this farm, then the true price would be much higher. So I think in the end, it's not a natural given that the prices are like that, but it's a factor of decisions and of regulations that it's possible to produce something like that at such a cheap price.
Sorry to intervene again, but for example, renewable energy, thanks to a mix of government intervention, the global goal on climate, and of course investment from the private sector, solar energy that 20 years ago was unaffordable, today is competitive with coal for sure, it's cheaper than coal, and it's cheaper in many places than oil and gas. So it can happen. It can happen. The transition can happen if both corporate sector and governments align in making it happen.
I join the opinion of my fellow panelists. I think it's probably unpopular to hear, but it's like some things have to be more expensive in order to make sure that the market's actually correctly reflected. For example, we take all the services a beautiful natural forest does for us, for example, clean air, clean water for granted for free, and that's not reflected in any of these markets for cheap meat, right? And if we would put the real price, if we can measure that and put the real price into the economy, you will see that things are much, much different.
Absolutely, but thank you for the question. I think it's a really, really important question of the affordability of sustainability, and I think Minister made that a related comment when she was talking about somebody who lives, for example, in rented accommodation, doesn't have the choice of energy supply and so on. I think that's an important question. And of course, indeed, us putting pressures on our government who can regulate or help regulate this, for example, through taxation, in addition to the other suggestions that were made. Are there any other questions or comments from the floor? There's a question here in the middle.
Thank you. I think most of the inventions we had in the last 60 years at least are mainly driven by economy, by economic interests. And we start realizing that not all of them are favorable, are advantages to us, to ourselves. Ms. Lambertini said the last 60 years were the worst in developing of humanity. I can understand that. As nature worked up to date, an overpopulation was in most cases corrected by fighting it. So I question whether fighting COVID-19 was such an advantageous to our mankind, because we think the main problem finally is that human beings are too many, or got too many, the last 60 years.
Challenging intervention there. Would any of my panelists care to comment?
I'm happy to go. It is an important question, and there is no doubt that the population growth of the last 60, 70 years have been a cause of the growth of the footprint. But particularly because the consumption model, particularly in the richer world, was completely unsustainable. And so it is the number of people, but even more so, the consumption level in some parts of the world. The two combined has created the problem that we're facing. But still remember that billions and billions of people in the world today are not having the same footprint of the North. And so we need to keep that in mind. But there is no doubt the population, we've been adding 1 billion new people to the planet every decade for the last 4 or 5 decades. So there is no doubt that this is a dimension, but it's not the only one. We need to focus on consumption as well, particularly on consumption now.
And we only touched in our conversation on circular economy today, and of course, throughout the past 60 years that were just mentioned, we had a focus on constant economic growth. And proponents of circular economy will, of course, say that nothing in nature grows without limit. There are cycles of growth, but there are cycles of attrition. So why should we expect that our economies will grow ad infinitum? And indeed, reflection on that, I think, is very, very important. There was a question right behind you, I think. Yeah.
I wanted to reflect on a memorable phrase from earlier, which was unsustainable development, and acknowledge the role that development with a capital D has actually had in contributing to the degradation of nature and biodiversity. To take an example, in small island developing states, which are kind of at the forefront of the climate emergency, the model of development that has prioritized monoculture and has forced populations to move to coastal areas has actually been a big factor in that. And so whilst I really appreciated the final thoughts from the panel on what we can do as consumers, I'm actually interested to hear what you think we should prioritize in terms of systems change. So, you know, the response to the pandemic, of course, there were a lot of successes, but it was also characterized by vaccine nationalism and a lack of international financing from the multilateral system that, you know, is set up to provide just that. And so if we are to actually tackle this problem, we're going to need a really focused shared agenda. So what do you think that should look like?
Great question. Anyone?
I maybe don't have a good solution, but I think what the pandemic has shown that we can have vaccine nationalism, but as long as the virus is circulating somewhere else, we will have a variant, and that we are all in this together, and that we cannot buy ourselves out of this problem. And I think it's the same with climate change. Of course, rich countries can maybe delay the effect of all of this maybe for one more generation, but sooner or later it will hit them. And I think, I mean, the pandemic maybe was a good or a bad example. I think it has both sides, but it has really made it clear for all of us that there is no there are no islands. We are all in this together, and we have to decide on on a common way to get out of this. But I think there's also a positive aspect, because right now there is a lot of negative feedback. Deforestation leads to more pandemic, climate change leads to pandemic, consuming meat leads to pandemic, leads to deforestation, leads to climate change. So it's all together, but it also means, on the other hand, if there are solutions, then a solution for one problem would also help to solve the other one. So I think this is maybe also a positive message that maybe is not communicated enough, that if we find the right way and the right tools, that we will solve a lot of problems at the same time. And I think this is really a very nice prospect, and that should somehow motivate everyone to work on that. Yeah.
Thank you. And I think, you know, the call to change our diet, which actually was you know, made by almost every panelist earlier, in some way offers a system solution, because by choosing our diet to shift away from eating meat, we are affecting land use, we are going to contribute to reducing climate change, we are going to contribute to greater diversity, which of course is often in opposition with agriculture and so on. So sometimes simple solutions can be truly systemic, but I think your question is really important, that we have to focus on the interconnectivity of these problems, and then again on the local and global scales. Absolutely. Any other there's a hand there.
Hi. I'm working very hard with my NGO to nudge people to see sustainability in a positive way, and that it can also be fun. But we're struggling, and I've heard some really great positive examples from you guys, but maybe to draw a bit more inspiration, would you have more to share here?
Polite way to say that we failed to provide stronger arguments.
And can I just ask you, before you surrender your microphone, what are the main causes of sort of reluctance to see sustainability as a positive thing that you've experienced?
I would say skepticism somehow. I had a conversation yesterday with somebody who owns its private jet, and we had actually a very good open conversation about this. And he also told me, I really feel that only when people along the value chain are all economically motivated, change will happen. And there are only a few people like you who kind of do it intrinsically. And yeah, I get a lot of that. However, when I do interact, or when we with our organization do interact with people, we do see sparks and we do see change. But the scaling up is difficult somehow.
Go ahead. So economic motivation, do we really need that?
I wouldn't say only economic motivation, but motivation based on benefits, on something that you receive back and that you feel is a positive contribution to your life. I mean, we are all here to try to live a better possible life in the respect. The question is, do we need to do that in the respect of everybody else, so and the planet? That's the mind shift. But you know, I've been involved for many years, when I was younger in particular, directly with local communities in Europe, elsewhere, to, for example, create protected areas. Creating a protected area is a difficult discussion at the local level, because you're going to protect, conserve, restrict, to some extent, access of some sort, even in Europe. You know, you can't build houses in a protected area, so you can't make money out of this kind of activities, for example. And so there is a sort of opposition to that. But at the end of the day, the protected area, if the protected area is able to provide benefits, could be recreational, could be income from tourism, could be access to sustainable resources for indigenous people, for example, they manage the protected area, then the benefit is an incentive, a strong motivation to make that decision, to actually protect rather than utilize. And so it is about benefits at the end, but there needs to be benefits compatible with the planet and with the society at large. And so I would agree, but it's not just economy, it's more than that. Nature provides so many more services than just material services. Inspiration, beauty, relax, healing, so important for many, many things.
As a young person, we do suffer, not necessarily just young people, but like the term that is often mentioned is eco-depression, eco-anxiety. Things are looking very dark because we do know the science nowadays, and we do understand that it's getting very, very difficult without personal sacrifices of building a better world and like preserving what we have. But I want to remind you of these benefits by reminding you of the pandemic. When Switzerland had a pandemic and we had the lockdown, it was the forest that gave me back like my life energy, like everything was closed, but walking through the forest, being in nature, hiking around the country is the most beautiful, refreshing thing that one can get when you're sitting all day at home and having nothing, lost all the consumption power, right? And that's the world we want to build, and that's the world we want to preserve. Even if we probably don't make 1.5, if we are trying to build transition to green energy, protecting more forests, regaining more nature in our cities, that's a beautiful place to live in. Just remember, this is like, it inspires us, it gives us fresh air, clean water, and it doesn't even ask for a check for this.
Do you want to come in?
Yeah,
Please.
so I sometimes also think that, people are lazy and people like to continue the way they live because you don't have to think about it, it's convenient, it's like you've always did it. And I think sometimes it's just about making choices easier. So if you live in a city where you have nice bike lanes, if you have a place where you can leave your bike, it does not get wet, then you're more likely to take the bike. Or if you have a canteen where you have choices between different types of vegetarian food, then, I think sometimes it's just having the choice or making it easy for people to make the right choice. And I think this can be very small, pragmatic things. Or, for example, during the pandemic, a lot of people realized that it's also nice to go on holidays within their own countries and not take the plane. And I think there are a lot of small things that sound maybe trivial to us, but if everyone does it, or if you just make it easy for people to do that, then you can make a choice. You can make a difference just by making it easier for people to take that choice.
Absolutely. I can share with you, I won't, I can share with you my personal experience of discovering two amazing areas in the United Kingdom where I live, which I would have never discovered probably otherwise. But Stefan, I wanted to bring you in because you spent obviously the pandemic in many different discussions with businesses, with governments, with philanthropists, etc., etc. What's your experience of bringing people to your perspective, to your point of view, which is in effect what you were saying in a specific case of...
I think the difference between the pandemic and the climate is, as David was saying, people all felt the urgency. As I said, in my first comment, my biggest worry is most people don't appreciate that we don't have any time. And so in life, when you think you have time, then you become lazy, as was said before. And the analogy I will make, for example, on switching the diet, which is not hard, it's like wearing a mask. I wore a mask during the pandemic, not because I thought I was going to die. I'm 50-year-old, I'm pretty healthy, but so that if I got it, I didn't give it to somebody that I could kill, literally. And so is this kind of civility, and I think as a world we've become, very on our phone and very individualistic and so on, and we lost sense of community. If you look where humans used to be, used to be in villages and everybody used to know each other, everybody used to take care of each other, especially the elderly or the sick, because that's what the community used to do. And now we don't do that anymore. We do that as a society, and we do it very well most of the time, but we don't do it ourselves. One of the things I'm trying to push the team at Moderna to do is to volunteer. We give away hours where people can volunteer and get full pay and so on. And I try to lead by example, to go volunteer in the community, cleaning the river, or going to the kitchen for the homeless. Because as I like to tell employees, I say, how do you expect to live in a nice community if you do nothing for your community? Most people do nothing for their community in terms of their time and engagement. Some people do amazing things for their communities. But again, it's the type of thing that if we all do a little bit for the community, then we all live in great communities. As how I see the climate and the planet this is the extent to our community. This is where we live. We cannot live without the planet. The planet is going to be okay. It might take, 100 million years to get back to a good state, but the planet is going to be okay. The human species won't be okay.
Yes, absolutely. And the point about the community is actually reminds me of another session I attended earlier today, and that session was on mental health, and of course how important the sense of community and the health of community is for mental health, and that, although not necessarily directly related to a wake-up call from nature, is certainly going to affect how you respond to that call.
But as David was saying, I mean, a lot of people we discovered walking in the forest or parks during the pandemic, and a lot of people, were not in a good place from a mental health standpoint. And I told everybody, including our kids, which was 18 and 19, to get out during the pandemic. I was like, I like to remind people, we used to live in the forest. From a biological standpoint, because, I believe, like Marco, that, our genes have massive wiring in how we behave and how we feel, is we used to be in the forest. So just seeing trees, seeing plants makes us happy. But when you're behind your phone and then you're in your car and then you are in an office, or you don't see nature. One of the reasons I love to go to work, I walk to my office, I don't own a car. And I cross the river in Boston, between Boston and Cambridge, and just seeing water and seeing trees and hearing birds, it only makes you happy. I don't know any human being that makes me sad. And so I think that if we all, in how we manage our life, try to do a few tweaks, and if we get our friends and our neighbors and our co-workers to do the same, we all can have a huge impact, because I believe that there's an incredible leverage that we can get for the system.
Marco, you want to?
No, just reflect. I completely agree. Just reflect. We live in a city and we bring plants inside our house. We bring animals and pets. We need that contact with nature. And I think that's the ultimate realization that we need to really get in our heads. We need nature much more than nature needs us. We are a little component of a big natural world, but we need that natural world, the contact, everything. And we were born in nature, we evolved in nature, we need that contact. Kids, I remember the first time I took my son to see an animal, or I brought a cat in the house. The excitement, there's nothing, very little things that can excite a kid, a young child, more than an animal. And that's in our genes, as you say, it's a natural reaction. Then we're losing that because we become busy with our own kind of way of living. But we need to remember that there's a beautiful little movie called Nature Speaks. You should look up on YouTube. It's actually not from WWF, from another organization called the Conservation International. And at the end, nature says, because you think you're here to save me, but actually this is not true, because I can change, I can adapt. Can you? Speaking to us. I think that's exactly what it's all about.
That's a wonderful quote on which I think we should probably close. But Marco again reminded us that we're not apart from nature. So the reason why we need nature, because of course we are part of it. So I think when we are responding to that call, when we're thinking what we can do, we have to continuously think about the fact that we are very much part of it. We are within it. Thank you very much to my panel. This was a terrific discussion. Thank you very much to all of you for your attention and fantastic questions from the audience. Thank you. We all have homework to do. Yes. Thank you very much.